It was a normal calm morning in a post-apocalyptic city and the sun was rising above the wall. The city was shrouded in car smoke and fog and at first glance it was very ordinary, but if you looked closely you could see that the city was surrounded by a high wall like a medieval castle. Everything looked peaceful and there was nothing to portend trouble. But then what could the inhabitants be hiding from? Our protagonist went to Tony's barbershop to cut his wild and messy hair. The barber was skillfully working with scissors and was soon to finish the haircut. In the background the TV was on with the news, where they told that according to the analysis from different departments, terrors could invade the city and asked everyone to try not to panic because the government had already sent hunters to ensure the safety of the citizens. Tony said that the government was lying on the news. If the land was really safe enough, then why would the rich people build flying cities to save themselves? The protagonist answered him that he was right, but the barber asked him not to turn his head or he would cut off something unwanted. The hero was silent and immersed in his thoughts. He thought that even the fact that the government tells them in advance about the approaching terrors is the greatest favor from their side. The wealthy powerful people of this world had built themselves special flying cities that soared high in the sky and there they were safe, despite all the chaos that was going on below. And then he suddenly said that even that would be ended soon. His words perplexed the barber who didn't know what he was talking about and even stopped cutting his hair. The barber Tony asked him not to joke around like that anymore. He hoped that as long as they had hunters and their skills this would never happen. Personally, he had never seen a terror and he wondered what they were like. Our hero looked at him askew and replied with a chuckle that they looked like the most terrifying monsters. While they were talking in the background a government advertisement was running on TV about how to ensure your funeral. And in case the death was due to the terrors, a 60% discount was given. Tony nonchalantly continued to haircut our hero wondering if he would ever meet the terrors. But no sooner had he finished his sentence than his head and with it the whole building was cut by a thin and precise cut. His head immediately split into two parts, splattering everything around with blood, but our hero sat in his chair without moving. There was absolute chaos in the city, buildings collapsing because of someone's powerful cuts. It turned out that these cuts weren't made with blades or any other weapons, they were made with giant scissors held by someone's disgusting hands. It was a monster that had scissors or scissor blades instead of arms, legs and other limbs and now this monster was standing over the dead Tony and laughing disgustingly. It licked the bloody blades and ironically said it was apologizing for accidentally hurting him. She leaned over them and asked did he not remember her. He was the one who had fired her that time hadn't he? But she quickly got bored of talking to the corpse and turned her attention to the customer who was still sitting in the chair. And she excitedly exclaimed that there was another customer to play with. She went up to him and with her scary smile asked him if he was afraid of her or if he wanted her to practice on him too. But then his face contorted into a grimace of rage and he exclaimed, "My hair." He was furious that Tony had cut off the extra when he lost his head. Monster was surprised at this behavior of his. She couldn't believe he was bothered by all this just now and promised that she would fix it now. And said that this time she would try to be more delicate with his flesh. She started to close her scissors going to take his head off as well. He had to do something or he'd be following Tony's fate. So he shouted Tong's name, calling for his assistant. She immediately appeared and asked how many times she had to tell him not to call her like that. His arm was immediately enveloped in living growths like some terror. And on that growth, an eye appeared. In the next instant, he dodged the scissor strike and pulled out a katana from the growth on his arm. Tong indignantly asked to be called a slasher. And for good reason, because the katana, which was one of Tong's abilities and herself at the same time, chopped absolutely everything. Our hero used it without delay. And chopped up the monster along with his menacing scissors. The monster couldn't believe it and its wounds glowed with black and red lightning discharges. Our hero didn't pay attention to her anymore and put on his hood to avoid getting dirty and got ready to leave. And in the next moment the monster showered everything around with a fountain of blood. It was the end for her. Our hero started to take off his hood and said sorry. "I'm sorry I cut your flesh on purpose." But for such pathetic behavior, he was immediately slapped by Tong, who told him to stop sounding so cool. And then she smugly asked him how many times she had to tell him to call her Mrs. Slasher. But the protagonist didn't learn from his mistakes and continued to annoy her by saying, "Well Tong, no problem Tong." Such insolence made Tong's helmet light up with rage and she asked if he was up for a fight. Our main character's name was Li Fan and he was a D-rank terror hunter. And right now, he was looking at his messed up hair in the mirror. While Tong was laughing at him saying what an ugly hairstyle and she thinks it suits him. The so-called terror hunters are a group of people who exist to fight terrors. Their rank is determined by the government depending on their strength. But our hero was different from all of them because besides that, he was also a traveler from another world. Tong was rushing Li to absorb the power of the terror faster. Without wasting any time, he stabbed his katana into the defeated terror and the power of that monster immediately began to be absorbed through him. This was another feature of him as a person who had been transported from modern times to the world of fighting terrors, and thus he deserved to have his own system whereby every terror he defeated was absorbed by Tong, who liked it all very much. After absorbing the terror's power, Tong could modify and improve its various weapons and equipment according to its needs and desires. But this terror was very weak and there was almost nothing to take from it. While Tong absorbed the rest of the terror's power, our hero stared thoughtfully at one of the flying cities. He reflected that he never wanted to be like the other travelers who killed terrors just for power, fame, and money. But he had another goal that he had been working toward for 5 whole years. He just wanted to complete his mission to end it all and go back to his peaceful life in his home world. He thought longingly of his family, his mother, his father, and especially his little sister, who had been kidnapped in front of his eyes 5 years ago and there was nothing he could do then. But now he was determined to find his little sister Yike. But his memories and thoughts were interrupted by Tong, who tiredly pointed out that he was sucking the last juices out of the monster and he should have stopped long ago. The only thing Li could say was, "Ouch." He pulled out his katana and the dried corpse and asked Tong how many terrors did he need to kill to get home. Tong opened the information window to see. It turned out that he had already killed 9,995 terrors and only had 5 left to complete the main mission. Li repeated thoughtfully, the last 5, he had just a little more to go. And he would finally be able to leave this cursed world. And just in front of him, as if to order, appeared 5 terrors that broke everything in their path gradually approached him. They were the very same terrors that were talked about in the news. The hero's attention was attracted by a sound behind him, another breaking news from the already broken TV. The terrors that were heading for the city C abruptly changed their direction to the city A. All the inhabitants of the city were asked to prepare and go to the shelters. But before going to fight the terrors, our hero had one more urgent thing to do. He made an improvised grave for a barber from a piece of a building, where he wrote, "Here is buried poor barber Tony." And after giving him the last piece for his faithful service, they were going to face the terrors together. Li Fan was going into this battle more elated than ever. After all, these were the last terrors and he had wanted to go home for a long time. The day had finally come. At least he hoped so. But before our hero reached them, terror was raging in the center of the city. The frightened citizens tried their best to escape with cries that the terror is here and they do not want to die. Some managed to escape, and some were already in the merciless arms of the terrors, for whom people were nothing more than pathetic insects, and terror used its power to destroy them massively. And now even those who seemed to have escaped to a safe distance were now victims of the ruthless terror. There were those who were more fortunate and were able to hide among the ruins from the gaze of the terror. However, even they realized that this was the end. This time it was definitely the end for them. After all, even their defenders, the guardians of the city A, Wan Feilu under the nickname Feet Without a Shadow, and Tom under the nickname Cat Man, were defeated, and now they ordinary people have no chance to survive and the terror will devastate their city to the ground. But one of the survivors reassured the other that they still have hope. For before this attack, 3 hunters had come to their town. One of them a true legend and a powerful rising star. He was already approaching the battlefield surrounded by yellow lightning discharges. He landed on the battlefield right between the terrors and the fleeing people, raising a cloud of dust and lightning. The hero was excited about the battle and was confident in his strength. He said that it looked like he wasn't quite too late and he wasn't called Lightning Wang Lei for nothing. He leisurely and theatrically counted all the terrors on his fingers and found out that there were 5 of them. And then joyfully announced that today he would definitely increase his rank when he defeated them all. But he didn't have time to rejoice for long because a shadow immediately loomed over him. It was the shadow of the foot of one of the terror who was about to crush this arrogant insect. And with a cry of death, he unleashed his full power on the place where the hero had been a moment ago, scattering stones in all directions. But as soon as the dust cleared, the terror was surprised to find the place empty. He didn't understand where his victim had disappeared to. The hero was already behind him and told the monster that he was too slow. The hero was preparing a counterattack and was already shrouded in flashes of lightning, preparing his lightning strike, rushing at the enemy. He was as fast as lightning. And in the next instant, his strike hit the terror directly. The battlefield was shrouded in clouds of smoke and dust, nothing could be seen. But even without seeing the results of the blow, the surviving townspeople immediately began to cheer with joy. They thought they were saved and the hero had already defeated the first terror. One of the guys who were hiding among the ruins started pulling out a book from his backpack and telling the other that this hero was the most famous rising star of the government, so he was very glad he could buy his book before he became famous at a low price. He thought what a great guy he was. The book was called Terror Hunter and it was the 7th Terror Hunter book released by the Hunter Guild. It contained all C-ranked hunters, including those with Lightning Wang Lei. This book originally cost 2,998, but if he wanted it, he offered to buy it from him for 5,000. The latter advised him to stop speculating at least at a time like this. The next moment his eyes filled with horror when he saw that the one who had tried to sell him the book a moment ago had been impaled by several tentacles. It was another terror that had found their hiding place and was destroying what was left of the corpse with the words, "Die human." The survivors were desperately trying to run far away. From the remains of the corpse monster picked up a book and began to read it thoughtfully. He wondered what kind of book it was about hunters. Was it a new method of fake triumph created by inferior creatures in an attempt to feel protected? The other monster that had gotten hit by the hero before was rising from the ruins. He was relatively unharmed and was furious that these damn insects were fighting back. Such disrespect made the hero angry and asked how dare they humiliate humanity right in front of him. This was unforgivable. He started gathering lightning bolts around him and even used them to bounce off the ground. After that, he soared through the air gathering all his power in his right fist for a final strike. A blue ball of lightning formed around his fist and he rushed at the monsters with it. The strike was really strong, but to his surprise it didn't produce the expected results. Moreover, the monster remained unharmed after he put all his power into his thunderbolt. And while he was trying to attack one monster, another terror crept up from behind and prepared its attack. The monster that looked like a mutated octopus on crab legs released a beam of blue energy from its mouth. Even a fast hero like Wang Lei couldn't dodge such an unexpected attack and barely managed to block it. However, it didn't help him much and he received the full blow, bouncing around like a ball on the rocks for several dozen meters. The terrors saw this as an opportunity to attack him, and they all swarmed towards him, trying to grab him with their tentacles. Wang Lei barely had time to dodge one tentacle after another, each one nearly reaching its target. Some of them he even had to block. The hero didn't understand if these monsters were brothers or why they all had bloody tentacles. But even in all this turmoil, he noticed one monster standing off to the side and he had a plan. He smiled slyly to himself and thought how clever he was. Since there were too many of them, it would be easier if he got rid of the weak ones first. He used a thunderclap to fend off the tentacle attacks and moved quickly. In the next instant he disappeared from where he was and the 4 terrors stared at the trail of lightning. While those terrors were confused, the hero rushed towards the monster that was standing aside. He wanted to start with it and destroy it first. But that monster that looked like a mummy with many arms was not so weak. As soon as the hero was within his reach, many hands and bandages rushed at him. He didn't even have time to do anything as many bandages tied him up without letting him move. He thought that the terror would not be able to hold him down with some miserable bandages and smiled as he began to gather lightning around him. But it wasn't enough, and even his full strength wasn't sufficient to free himself. The hero stared at the bandages with an uncomprehending look and couldn't believe his eyes, how they could absorb all his electricity. How did terror have such an ability? Meanwhile, the terror began to slowly pull the bound hero closer to him, intending to finish him off. Wang Lei, seeing his imminent end, began to resist with all his might, but he failed. After all, the bandages were absorbing not only his electricity, but his physical strength as well. The other terrors were also closing in on him. He realized that his end was near, and it seemed that nothing could save him anymore. He said disappointedly that he didn't think his career as a hero would end before it began. In the end today he still couldn't save anyone. The survivors started to run away in panic. They saw that even the legendary Wang Lei couldn't handle these terrors. Meanwhile, our protagonist was in a great mood and seemed to be having a great time. He calmly rode his scooter and was happy that no one seemed to have touched his loot. Tong noticed that if he hadn't stopped at every stoplight, they would have gotten here much sooner. But fast or slow, they did arrive at the battle site. And seeing all these terrors together, Tong smiled gloatingly, glad that there were so many of them here together, and she hoped they would be very tasty. Seeing that some madman had come here and completely didn't understand what was going on, Wang Lei shouted to him, "Idiot, quickly get out of here or else you'll die." But before he could even speak, the tentacles of one of the terrors rushed towards the idiot. One of the monsters was approaching Li Fun with lightning speed, and was not even aware of any resistance, hoping for a quick bite. But our hero was prepared for it and reassured Wang Lei that he could take it easy. His arm had already begun to transform. The terror that a moment ago was thinking of an easy snack watched in horror at the giant hand that was approaching him. He didn't even have a chance to dodge, and the hand grabbed him right by his ugly eye, and pressed down on him with such force that he was crushed like a piece of dough. Li Fan smugly said that it was actually quite strong, and it was already a 9,996 monster. The ability he used to finish off the monster was called muscle strengthening. The other terrors and the another hero stared at him without believing their eyes. They didn't understand how he could have such strength. Was he really an S-rank hunter? But then why had no one ever even heard of him? One of the terrors even asked our protagonist who he was, while looking at a book he had taken away from one of the residents. Our protagonist replied that he was a terror hunter and his name was Li Fun. After using the skill, his arm returned to normal. The monster pensively started flipping through the book looking for such a name, but he couldn't find anything. Seeing his confusion, Li prompted him that perhaps he couldn't find it there because he was only a D-ranked night guard. And in the book, there are most likely only C-rank hunters and above. But such information was resented by the other hero, who didn't understand since when did D-ranks become so powerful. The monsters relaxed with a sigh of relief, and since he was an ordinary D-rank loser, they thought they could easily get rid of him. Immediately after that, many tentacles rushed at our hero. But he didn't even move and only asked Tong if she was ready. She asked him in response, what did he think? He was about to use his favorite ability, Slash. Instantly, a huge sword with a bizarre shape formed in his hand, with which he instantly cut through all the tentacles flying at him. But that wasn't all, it was only the first attack, and right after it one three-eyed terror frowned, preparing his next surprise. It began to gather air into its giant maw, preparing a beam of energy. Li Fun put his hands on the ground to defend himself, going to summon a barrier. And when the monster gained enough energy and opened its giant mouth, in front of Li was a red energy-reinforced stone wall. A blue beam of energy immediately flew into it, the wall cracked from the impact, but still stood firm. Li wasted no time and prepared a surprise in return. He was gathering his strength for an instant rush. And as soon as the attack stopped, he snapped at lightning speed to attack from the other side. In his hand, he was already holding a katana. He jumped high above the monster and gathered the energy to chop it with a single blow. Which he did, adding another monster to his score. There were only 3 left. The remaining terrors, seeing the fate of their fellow terror, were frightened at the mere sight of our hero. Lee decided not to give them time for respite and prepare a plan, and immediately rushed towards them, telling them to keep up with their already deceased brethren. He decided to attack the black octopus first. But suddenly his seemingly fatal blow was blocked by the monster's armor. It just didn't penetrate its skin. Lee stared at his sword and at the monster without believing his eyes. The second monster had already started to chuckle at him, saying that it looked like his pity sword was unable to pierce through their armor. Such words made Tong furious. She was outraged at being called an pity sword and said that she would never turn into a sword again. Instead, she turned into a giant hammer, which Lee was going to use immediately. The hammer crushed two monsters at once. But it didn't just crush them, it smashed them with such force that a pillar of dust rose above the ruins. Lee was unhappy that he had once again stained all his clothes with this abomination. It wasn't just him, it was everything in the neighborhood. But Tong replied to him that it was his own fault. Wang Lei couldn't believe his eyes and asked how this was possible. He asked Lee, didn't hunters have just one ability? How could he use so many things? Lee pretended to think about this question, and then smugly replied that it was because he had taken the powers of all the monsters he had killed. In the background, Tong was already enjoying the banquet, enjoying the deliciousness of it all. Wang Lei couldn't believe how this was even possible. It was very unusual even by the standards of this world. Li Fun was about to end the last terror and the tong in his hand turned into a katana. Our hero pointed the katana straight at the monster and told him that he was the last one. But Wang Lei stopped him and asked him to wait. He advised him to be careful because this terror was different from the others and somehow managed to absorb all of its power. Hearing this, Li turned to Tong and said that absorbing other one's power was very similar to her skill. But she didn't want to admit their similarities and resented it, saying that her strength was different from that miserable monster's. However, even she felt that there was something familiar about this monster. But for now, it was unclear what it was. Li was confident in his victory and said that he didn't care what kind of strength this monster had. If he killed him, he could return to his past life, and for that he was ready to do anything. Our hero boldly jumped straight at the monster and told him to go to hell. Terror immediately released a multitude of bandages towards him, trying to tie him up. Tong warned Li to be careful. But he was ready for such an attack from the monster, and with a few quick movements, he cut the bandages into shreds. They were definitely not enough to hold back such a handsome guy. Li realized that all he needed to do to win was to avoid those bandages, and then this monster wouldn't be able to do anything to him. But terror had absorbed Wang Lei's power for a reason, and now he could use it himself. His lightning bolt almost hit our hero, leaving a deep scratch on his cheek. Li was surprised, he hadn't expected such an attack. Tong reminded him that he had almost died just now. Li himself knew it very well and excused himself that he was just being careless. Wang Lei was even more shocked. This was the first time he had seen a terror not only absorb someone else's power but also use it. Li realized that he needed to speed up. And for that, Tong had made him jet boots. Li immediately used them and rushed forward like a rocket. Terror used the stolen lightning technique again. But Li moved really fast, faster than the lightning bolts. And when a multitude of lightning bolts struck where he was a moment ago, he was already flying towards his goal. It seemed that the terror had no time to react and his fate was sealed. Li didn't hesitate for a moment and was ready to end everything here and now with a single strike of his katana. But what was his surprise when suddenly his katana stopped a few inches away from its target. Terror had not only stopped his katana by grabbing his arms, but he had also grabbed both of his legs, and now he was holding our hero with a dead grip. And not just held, he immediately began to absorb his power. After a few seconds, his boots began to lose their power. Tong notified Li that the reactive power of his boots had been absorbed. He replied in horror that he could see it himself. Terror was going to use his new power immediately after the absorption. He formed exactly the same jet engines on his hand as were on the boots of our protagonist. And he was going to smash this poor hero with it. The hand hit the armor our hero had summoned to protect himself. Terror immediately began to absorb this ability as well. Tong advised Lee to hurry because this ability would also be absorbed soon. At the same time as Monster was absorbing his power, he was also pressing down from above with his reactive arm. Lee could barely hold on and his arms swelled up so much from the exertion that they tore his clothes. He barely had time to jump out from under his defenses before the monster's hand sealed it to the ground with a loud crack. Lee was forced to admit that this terror was stronger than he had expected. Tong gloatingly told him that it would be much harder for him to return home now and perhaps they should retreat now. Wang Lei thought the same, for the terror seemed to be too strong. He advised our hero to wait for the S-rank hunter and together with him to defeat this monster. But Lee was determined and was not going to give his ticket home to someone else. He was thinking about how he could defeat this monster who had summoned a shell-like defense after absorbing another skill. Terror supported his shell with many hands and leisurely approached our hero. A satisfied smile appeared on Lee's face. It seems he realized how to deal with this monster. Although this terror could absorb other opponents' abilities, but it seemed to lack the intelligence of a human. Using the absorbed ability, the terror created armored gauntlets on his hands, specifically for enhanced strikes. And Lee noticed another interesting fact that this monster is not able to leave the ability for a long time, so he has to use them immediately after absorption. And knowing this, he stood fearlessly before attacking, knowing that the monster no longer had that speed. Wang Lei shouted to him to be careful. Well, now that monster didn't have that speed, Lee had no problem dodging his attack. He was ready to take advantage of his opponent's weakness to overpower him. Lee used his other skills and many thorny vines entangled the terror. And all of his limbs. Terror began to immediately absorb that skill as well. But he didn't make it to the end and many huge thick vines entangled him. Lee knew that now was his chance. With Tong's help, he summoned his katana again, which was now burning with fire. The flames on the katana grew bigger and bigger. And once again using the jet boot he aimed for his goal. This time the terror was bound and all his hands too, so there was no way he could reach our hero. Who delivered a devastating fiery blow. And what was left intact after the cut was engulfed in flames. Leaving what he thought was the corpse of the terror behind him to burn, he looked at the information window. The mission progress was frozen in place and he was literally half a point short. Lee was indignant. What the hell, what kind of ridiculous joke is this? Even Tong didn't know what was wrong and suggested that maybe terror was still alive. He didn't trustfully look at the burning remains of the monster. But what he saw there shocked him and he couldn't believe his eyes. There amongst the flaming remains of the terror was someone. Covered in flames and smoke. Lee just couldn't believe it could be true. There was his sister Yike. She looked a little different, but he couldn't be wrong, it was definitely her. It seemed like she was imprisoned inside this terror, but how could that be? And where could she have come from in this world? The next moment, he hurriedly shouted for Tong to act. Many ice shards immediately appeared around his hand and hovered in the air. After shouting, "Freeze," he immediately threw them towards the girl. Once on the surface, the ice immediately began to cool the heat and fire on the coffin, among the debris of which Yike was lying. Slowly approaching the place, he began to remove his cloak. Then, sitting down beside the girl and putting it on her, he wondered why his sister was here. Hearing his question, Tong indifferently asked how she knew about it. Then pointing at the girl he was already holding in his arms, she asked Li Fan if he was sure it was his sister. Looking at the face of the girl who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, the protagonist didn't know what to say. Mrs. Cutter added that it was as if she had been born from the womb of terror. These words did not add much joy to Li Fan, who still hoped that it was his sister, but thanks to his vast experience, he also realized that it could have been a trap. The moment when Yike was being carried away by a man crying and begging for help immediately popped up in the protagonist's mind. After comparing the facts, Li Fan came to the conclusion that it couldn't be his sister, as she simply couldn't become a terror. In the next moment, determination was reflected in his eyes. Rising to his feet, and pulling out a sword from his hand, Li Fan told himself that he shouldn't fall for it, as it was most likely just an illusion. Taking out his sword and looking at the girl lying on the ground, the protagonist called her a 10,000th girl and apologized to her. After which he put his sword to her beautiful sleeping face. However, in the next instant, the girl's sleepy eyes opened. Li Fan was surprised by this turn of events and immediately asked her why she had woken up now. The girl looked up and stared at the sword in front of her with incomprehension. But in the next moment, when she saw the guy holding the weapon, her face was filled with anger and rage. Li Fan continued to stare at her in bewilderment, not understanding what had caused such a sudden change of emotions. The next moment, girl stood up and clung to his chest, whimpering. The protagonist was confused by this behavior. But even so, he wasn't going to fall for it. Grabbing the girl by the head, he began to push her away from him. Pushing her away. He coldly ordered her to stay away from him, adding that she couldn't fool him. The next moment there was an awkward pause. The girl stared bewildered at the sword that was pointed at her, and with which the protagonist cut the cloak she was wearing, exposing part of her body. However, the girl suddenly moved towards the sword, and blood came out of the cut skin. Li Fan, though he was the one who was going to kill the girl, but the fact that she climbed onto the sword herself shocked him. But the girl did not stop there, and the next moment she wrapped her arms around the sword and stabbed herself even harder. As a result of which both the wound and her mouth bled. The girl with her glowing violet eyes stared at the protagonist with a sad look. Suddenly, she raised her trembling hand. Touching his cheek, and looking at Li Fan with a warm smile on her face, she said in a hoarse voice, "Bro, der." The main character opened his eyes wide and stared at the girl with bewilderment and shock. But in the next moment, she closed her eyes and started to fall to the ground. Li Fan caught her and removed the sword from her body, coming to his senses, shouted excitedly, telling her to come to her senses as she was about to die. Tong, who was hovering nearby, said that it would be better for her to die so that he could return to his world, then added that she was just a terror anyway. Hearing these words, Li Fan gritted his teeth as he realized that he was now acting on emotion alone. Taking the girl by the shoulder, he wanted to pull her away. But in the next moment he saw the scene where she looked at him with a gentle smile and called him brother. If there was even a chance that it was real, then. In the next second, the main character without turning around loudly called out to Mrs. Cutter, telling her to use quick healing. As soon as he put his hand on the girl's wound, she immediately began to emit a green healing glow. And just a moment later, the wound on the girl's body healed almost instantly. Tong, watching all this, could not help but wryly ask his master if he did not want to return to his homeworld. He continued to use healing and replied that he just didn't want to kill someone who was wearing his sister's face. And so it would be easier for him to kill another terror to complete the mission. He then put his arm around the girl's shoulder and lifted her into his arms, adding that she looked exactly like his sister, which could be an opportunity for them to connect and find out the truth. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind the departing protagonist, telling him to stop. It was the same yellow-haired guy that Li Fan had saved from death. Putting his hand on his chest, he said that his name was Wang Lei and that he had recently been promoted to S-rank. He then loudly added that he was very impressed with the abilities he had demonstrated. After bowing, he respectfully asked Li Fan if he would accept him as a disciple. This turn of events surprised everyone. However, the protagonist immediately said no. Wang Lei came closer and awkwardly chuckling and scratching the back of his head, he asked why he would not accept him as a disciple. Li Fan replied that it was too problematic for him, adding that he would soon leave this world anyway. Hearing the answer, the guy laughed awkwardly again. As he continued on his way, the protagonist irritably asked Wang Lei, who was following him, why he was following him when he had already explained to him that he was not accepting disciples. He scratched the back of his head and replied that his house was also that way. After climbing the stairs and finding himself on a floor with two neighboring apartments, Wang Lei happily pointed to them and called Li Fan master, saying that he really wasn't lying to him. The latter irritatedly replied that he shouldn't call him that. After entering his apartment, the protagonist tried to close it with his foot, but he was unable to do so. Wang Lei, who was walking behind him, started banging on the door, calling him master and asking him to let him in, as he wanted to learn his techniques and become stronger. But his attempts failed, as the next moment the door slammed shut in front of him, throwing him backwards, after which Li Fan's irritated voice told him to get lost. As the protagonist gently placed the girl on the sofa, Wang Lei's cries could not stop coming from behind the door, asking him to think about it. Turning to Li Fan, Tong called him heartless, and added with a smile that that guy really was sincere. To which he replied that he didn't want to get involved with someone from this world. Getting up from his knees, and looking at the girl lying on the couch, who resembled his sister very much, the protagonist thoughtfully said that he might know the origin of this terror. Looking at the floor and his clothes, which were all dirty and bloody, he turned around and headed out of the room, intending to take a bath. Tong immediately asked in a provocative voice what he would do if the girl woke up while he was taking a bath. The protagonist immediately thought about it, as he had not thought about such a scenario. Then raising his hand, which immediately glowed with pink light, he tied the girl with some pink material from his hand, resembling rubber. After saying that this should be enough, he headed for the bathroom. What he didn't notice was that the girl had already woken up the next moment and opened her eyes wide. After undressing, Li Fan climbed into the bathtub filled to the brim with water. After taking a comfortable position, he blissfully remarked in a happy and relaxed voice how nice it was to take a bath after a stressful day. Turning to Tong, who was swimming 100 meters with a serious expression on her face, he asked her what would happen to her if he returned to his world. She flipped onto her back and began to swim backwards and replied that in that case she would have to find a new host. Hearing the answer, he asked what system they used to choose hosts, and what the system itself got out of it. She leaned against the side of the bathtub with a bored look and asked him if he would believe her if she said she was bored. Li Fan turned his head to the side and said that it was okay if she didn't want to talk about it. The next moment, some sort of bang was heard, causing the protagonist to turn towards the door. Behind the blurred glass of which some silhouette could be seen, which was the cause of the noise. Suddenly the door broke with a rumble and flew aside. Immediately behind the door appeared the girl, who at that time must have been lying on the sofa. Seeing that the door had broken, Li Fan shouted furiously, asking why she had broken the door. Tong continued to swim calmly and told him that it was not the door that he should be worried about. To which he irritatedly replied that she was right, as he had really tied that one up. The girl who entered, as if trying to explain how she got out, raised a finger in the air. Li Fan irritatedly wondered how he could understand what she was trying to say just by looking at her face. The next moment, the girl walked towards the bathroom with a determined gait. The protagonist gingerly pulled herself up, saying in an irritated voice that they couldn't trust terror. Once she got close enough, she threw off her cloak with a sudden movement. And in the very next second, with a relaxed look, she spat into the bathtub directly, leaving Li Fan completely bewildered. Seeing the girl relaxed and contentedly pressed against his chest, he asked Tong if she wanted to trap him with her beauty. Tong smiled slyly and replied that perhaps she had duckling syndrome. Explaining that it was a phenomenon when chicks recognize the first creature in their field of vision as their mother, so they subconsciously become dependent on it. Then adding that she congratulated him on his paternity. These words brought the protagonist to his senses, and he immediately dismissed the girl, telling her not to confuse her identity, as she remained a terror. However, after looking at the girl again, he couldn't help but recognize that she was indeed beautiful and looked innocent, causing his face to immediately turn red. Suddenly, his hand grabbed the bewildered girl's head. Then he forcefully lowered her head into the water. She opened her eyes wide, not realizing what was happening. Noticing that Li Fan was blushing, Tong asked him why he hadn't gotten rid of her yet, to which he turned away and said that it was better to leave it as it was. When he let go of the girl's head, the protagonist pointed his finger at her and asked her what her name was. The girl hesitated, as if remembering what it meant. But after a moment she answered with a happy smile on her face that her name was Alice. Breaking their happy atmosphere, Tong asked how long they were going to be here, since the water was already cold. Li Fan, still red from the hot water or embarrassment, replied that it would be a while. The sound of the hair dryer Li Fan used to dry the girl's hair could be heard in the room. After he finished drying it, he said that now was a good time to talk about why she looked so much like his sister. "Alice is your sister?" she asked, looking at the protagonist. Putting down the hair dryer, he turned to Tong and said that it didn't look like she was smart. Mrs. Cutter replied that they probably wouldn't be able to get the information they wanted from her either. Opening the closet where his clothes were hanging, Li Fan took out a set of clothes and threw them to the girl and said that she could wear them for now. Not paying attention to him, the girl immediately started to change her clothes, causing him to turn away and tell her not to change in front of him. After changing and standing on the floor, the girl looked at her clothes and told him she was done. Her pretty and cute face, combined with her beautiful figure, was so attractive that the protagonist couldn't take his eyes off her. When he came to his senses, he took her by the shoulder and told her that he would buy her some clothes tomorrow. The next moment, a rumbling sound that came directly from Alice's stomach rumbled through the room, causing her to put her hands on her stomach in confusion. Seeing this, Chief Li Fan said that now was the right time to eat. After coming to the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator, which was full of all sorts of food. After taking out what he needed, he started cooking. By his movements and the speed with which he did it, you could tell that he was very good at it. After a while, in front of a hungry Alice, whose mouth drooled at the sight of the table, appeared a lot of dishes that looked no worse than what my grandmother cooked. Watching her concentrating on what to do with the rice, Li Fan thought to himself with a warm smile on his face that she was really like Yike. However, in the next moment, irritation appeared on his face and he shouted to the girl who ate the rice and tried to swallow the bowl that she was not allowed to do so. Some time later, when he saw the empty plates after dinner, he asked Alice, who was sitting across from him, if she didn't have an ounce of common sense. She pointed to the empty bowl and replied in a slightly sad voice that she was not full. Hearing this, the protagonist immediately opened the refrigerator, but to his surprise he found it empty. With an annoyed look, he wondered when she had time to eat all the food that he bought. However, it was too late to go out, because at this time no store was open. At the same time, a brutal man covered in sweat was lifting weights with his muscular arms. A knock on the door interrupted his exciting pastime and he turned his head in surprise. When he opened the door, he found that behind it stood the guy whose student he wanted to become, as well as a girl who was hiding behind his back. Turning to the protagonist, he asked in surprise if he had come to take him on as a student. To that he did not change his face and replied that he did not call him that. Then pointing to Alice, he asked if she had food, explaining that the girl had a very good appetite. After placing a whole bunch of canned food and snacks on the table, Wang Lei said that his master and his mother could have whatever they wanted. Wang Lei irritatedly replied that she was not his mother. Alice's eyes lit up at the sight of the food. Left alone with the food in front of her, she stared at it. A moment later, however, there was no trace of the pile of food. The food had fallen into the bottomless stomach of the girl, who was chewing on the leftovers sticking out of her mouth. What they saw shocked both guys, as they had never thought that all the food would run out so quickly. In the next moment, Wang Lei was shocked and asked how she could eat it all at once, while the protagonist angrily clenched his fist and said that it was impossible to eat it all together with the package. He ruffled the girl's hair and asked how she could be such a glutton and still be so thin. Hearing this, Tong jealously replied that the system was still much prettier. After a while, putting his hand on his rumbling stomach, Li Fan said that he had been so busy feeding Alice that he had forgotten to eat. Hearing this, Wang Lei said with a smile that he knew just the right place to eat even at this late hour. After a while, their company arrived at a brick building with two men standing near the entrance. Greeting one of them, who was an acquaintance of his, the yellow-haired guy smilingly asked him if he was still on guard today. He replied that the place was so noisy that it was impossible to quiet it without a strong man like him. He opened the door and let them in. Following Wang Lei down the stairs, the protagonist pointed out that this place didn't look like an ordinary grocery store. When he addressed him as a master, he told him not to think wrongly about this place just because of its appearance. When he went to the door and opened it, he said that he was happy to welcome them to the underground paradise of a city. Li Fan and the girls' mouths fell open in surprise at what they saw. A huge hall filled with many young people singing and dancing to loud music opened before their eyes. Following the red-haired guy, the protagonist asked him if this place had always been here. Well, he replied that this place is the responsibility of a very powerful man who was also in the ranks of hunters. Hearing this, he immediately asked why that person didn't come to the rescue when this city was attacked by terrors. Wang Lei replied that they were sent to the city by the unified government as part of their work. And that was why even if other hunters were in the city at that moment, they could only help if they wanted to. Hearing this, the protagonist realized that the internal politics of the hunters were also very complicated. When he came to his senses and looked around, he realized that Alice had disappeared somewhere, so he immediately started looking around with the red-haired guy, trying to find the girl. Turning back, he found her in the middle of the crowd. But it wasn't that simple, as behind her stood a huge guy who was staring at her with his creepy eyes. Grabbing Alice's hand and calling her little miss, the ugly man with a nasty smile on his face asked if she would mind if he bought her some drinks. The girl's eyes opened wide in surprise. Seeing that she didn't react in any way, the man pulled the girl's hand toward him, asking why she was hesitating, irritably adding that she should hurry up and go to him. Then pointing to the outfit of the confused girl, he said that she had come here in it to seduce someone. Unable to bear it any longer, the protagonist swore and got up from his seat. Heading straight to the girl, he was filled with anger, as this scene reminded him of what happened in the past, and what he would never want to happen again. But as it turned out, the girl was not as defenseless as she might have seemed at first glance. In the next moment, her gaze became intimidatingly grim. The very next second she wrapped her arms around the man's huge arm and threw him to the ground, irritably yelling at him to get away from her. The man fell to the ground with a clatter, blood spurting from his mouth. Wang Lei's jaw dropped and he shockingly said that it was very cool. Tong turned to Li Fan and said that he seemed to have forgotten that she was a real terror. He grinned and replied that he was worried because she was small. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by a loud thump of someone's hand on the table. The culprit was a half-bald, large man sitting at a table against the wall, surrounded by his equally large friends. Standing up from the table, he turned to the girl and asked her in an angry voice how she dared to touch a member of their gang, bald, and then added that she wanted to get out of town. Hearing this, the protagonist was puzzled and asked why they called themselves the Bald Gang if they had hair. On what those showing their muscles and also flashing half-bald heads, replied that he did not understand anything. Explaining that the bigger their baldness, the stronger they became. To which the man scornfully replied that it appeared that they were all weaklings. The next moment, they all rushed at the protagonist, intending to teach him a lesson. At the same time, a strange pink substance began to gather in Li Fan's hand, which in the next moment formed into the handle of a hammer. Taking it with both hands, the protagonist stood up in a stance. And then swung it hard and fast. He struck the big guy closest to him with all his might. His eyes rolled back in pain and his nose bled. The impact was so strong that he flew backward at the speed of a cannonball and crashed into the members of his gang who were running after him. As a result, the entire Baldy gang was defeated in one blow. Alice enthusiastically raised more fingers to the top, looking at Li Fan with eyes glowing with admiration and calling him brother, saying that he was so strong. Li Fan replied that she should call him Li Fan. Wang Lei was frightened, and excitedly asked how the protagonist could use his ability here. To which he asked in response, couldn't he just fight back? To which the yellow-haired guy replied that if someone found out that he used his ability in the club, they would be finished. "You're already dead," said an unfamiliar voice that made the guys turn their heads in his direction. Walking towards them was a tall, pumped-up man with a bald spot on his head, who looked much stronger than the gang members from before. He was ranked 8th among the C rank, and was nicknamed the Mediterranean tyrant Li Weidong. Turning to Li Fan, he asked if he really thought that there was no one who could keep them in check. Walking up to Wang Lei and patting him on the face, he asked in a snide voice if he dared to challenge him after reaching C-rank. The protagonist turned to the yellow-haired guy and asked him who the old man was. He replied that he was the Mediterranean tyrant Li Weidong, who was the leader of the bald-headed gang in a city. Hearing this, the protagonist was surprised at how many bald men there were in this world, since they even had some sort of branch offices. However, his thoughts were interrupted by the gang leader, who came closer to him and called him a bastard. Then he clenched his huge fist and grinned a nasty smile and told him to get down and beg for forgiveness in front of the whole bald gang, and then he would spare him on behalf of the owner of the club. Not really afraid of the threat, and looking at him with a cold gaze, Li Fan asked what would happen if he didn't do so. Hearing the protagonist's words, he smiled evilly. The next moment, he angrily shouted at him to go to hell and swung his fist at him. However, the fist did not reach the target, as it was stopped by a cold female voice, which ordered him to stop. The owner of the voice was a woman with a beautiful figure. She was wearing a tight dress, and it was difficult for any of the men standing there to take their eyes off of it. The guards who appeared with her immediately cleared the way for her. Holding a curel in her hand, she said that she would like to see those who dared to make trouble on her territory. Upon seeing her, the big guy smiled awkwardly and greeted the woman by calling her boss Nya and adding that he hadn't seen her in a long time. Then pointing his finger at our couple, he added that that little thing was the first to start, so he had to act. Hearing his words, she slowly walked towards the protagonist, who looked at her indifferently. Approaching him almost point blank, she coldly asked him if the big guy was telling the truth. But Wang Lei intervened and respectfully asked the woman not to be angry and to forgive them, adding that his teacher didn't know the rules and didn't want to offend her. After taking another drag, she addressed him like a lay kid and asked him since when did he have a teacher. He tried to smile and replied that it was not long ago. The next moment, the leader of the bald gang leaned over to the woman and said that their gang was willing to pay double damages in return for a small request. The woman didn't turn around and asked what that request was. The man pointed his finger at Alice, who was trying to put a bowl full of apples in her mouth, and told the woman that she was the reason why everything started, and that he wanted her to let him deal with her personally. When the girl heard her name, she turned her head, trying to understand who was calling her. Li Fan's face turned cold and gloomy after hearing the big man's words. He immediately moved towards Alice with determination. Wang Lei wanted to stop him, telling him not to act rashly as he was sure that he would be able to negotiate. But he was not going to stop, and gloomily walked past Boss Nya and the gang leader, who looked at him in surprise. When he approached Alice, Li Fan immediately took away the bowl she was trying to swallow, irritatedly reminding her that he had already told her not to eat the dishes. At this disrespectful behavior of the guy, a vein of anger swelled on the woman's face, as she couldn't understand how he could not be nervous in her presence. Turning to him, she asked the protagonist if he had heard the proposal. He continued to squeeze Alice's cheeks, who was still trying to get her bowl back, and replied that he had heard everything perfectly well. Hearing this, she told him in a cold voice to drag the girl to her then. "And if I don't?" he asked in a cold voice, looking at the woman. The bandit leader heard his words and grinned, asking why he was so angry and adding that they weren't going to do anything to them now. However, the smile on his face was replaced by horror the next moment, as the strong hand of the protagonist grabbed him by the face. Then lifting the big man off the ground, Li Fan said in a cold voice that he could try if he wanted to. However, their pleasant pastime was interrupted by Boss Nya, who turned to the protagonist and asked how dare he do such a thing in front of her. After letting out a huge cloud of smoke that enveloped her from all sides, she added in a cold and gloomy voice that her name didn't mean anything to him. Seeing how Boss Nye's mood had changed, Wang Lei immediately told his teacher to apologize quickly in a frightened manner, because if he didn't do so right away, he would be in big trouble. Hearing this, the protagonist asked if that woman was really that powerful. He excitedly replied that of course she was, as she was ranked 108th among the B ranks and was also known as Nei Shinchio's smoker. Unable to tolerate being treated like this anymore, the woman exhaled a large amount of smoke. The next moment, something like a spear was formed and flew at a high speed straight towards Li Fan, who was still holding the big man. Seeing the approaching danger, Wang Lei panicked and shouted to his master to dodge. However, despite the approaching danger, Wang Lei continued to stand there, looking at the approaching spear. The next moment there was the sound of flesh being cut and a painful groan that belonged to none other than the gang leader. Blood spurted out of his mouth as his hands, which he was holding tightly to Li Fun, began to fall down exhaustedly. After the protagonist let go of the big guy, whose stomach had been punctured by the woman's smoke attack, his lifeless body began to fall to the ground. But nothing ended there yet. As the clouds suddenly burst out of the man's body, formed into a clawed paw, headed straight for the protagonist. But even though the attack was unexpected, he managed to dodge it. The next one did not follow, but the hall began to fill with smoke. The big man was finally able to fall to the ground in peace. Seeing the woman's cruelty to her ally, Li Fan asked the woman why she was being so insidious to her ally. To which, emerging from a large cloud of smoke that almost completely obscured her, she replied that there was no need to talk nonsense. She then put her hand, in which she held a pipe, forward out of the smoke. She shouted something loudly, calling for her smoke protectors. Immediately after her words, a multitude of knights who were wearing helmets and were also armed with swords formed from the smoke. Obeying the order of their mistress, they immediately rushed to attack the protagonist. He looked with his usual frown at the sword, which he managed to dodge without any problems just by moving a little aside. The very next moment he jumped into the air, appearing directly above the defenders, leaving them puzzled as they did not understand where he could go so quickly. Afterwards, Li Fan turned to the system and told it to activate the skill. The next moment, some energy began to gather between his hands, which in the next instant, as soon as he served his hands together, exploded, turning into a hurricane that destroyed all the smoke defenders that were attacking him. While some shouted frightenedly, others did not miss a moment to savor this wonderful opportunity sent by the heavens themselves. As soon as the smoke cleared, the guards as well as Boss Ne appeared behind them, who were covering themselves with their hands to protect themselves from the wind, and from their teeth clenched in anger, one could tell that they were clearly not happy about this resistance. While Alice continued to enjoy the free food without paying attention to anyone, Wang Lei gave a thumbs up and enthusiastically said that his teacher was really incredible. The woman, on the other hand, was not resigned to defeat and angrily looked at the protagonist and said that wind was indeed the best ability against her. However, this was not her only trump card. She shrouded one of her legs in smoke and headed towards the Li Fun. She then swung her smoke-enhanced leg at him and attacked him, grinning as she added that B ranks had more than just supernatural abilities. However, even so, he didn't change his face and said in an indifferent voice that the system should use the iron body skill. Hearing his words, Boss Nie's eyes opened wide with surprise and horror as she realized what it meant. But it was already too late. Catching her leg with his hand, which was now composed of iron, Li Fun said that he was also quite good at hand-to-hand combat. But that was the end of his pathetic speech, because the next moment, he blushed and looked away. Then, continuing to hold her leg, which gave him a view of something he shouldn't have been able to see, he asked embarrassedly if she was really going to continue standing like that. When she realized her mistake, she blushed and called him a bastard. Then shouting for him to back off, she swung her pipe, which thanks to the smoke turned into a sharp blade aimed directly at the neck of the protagonist. Breaking out of his tight grip and jumping high into the air, she tried to attack him from above with a furious face. The next moment, however, her face became even angrier as he managed to block her blade, simply reflecting it with his iron-covered hand. Realizing that she couldn't do anything to him in close combat, the woman jumped back to a safe distance and created an explosion of smoke. However, the protagonist managed to successfully dodge it by simply jumping up into the air. But he was not going to constantly just shorten and defend himself, and the next moment surrounded himself with a reddish substance. He put his hand in front of him and shouted to the system to use the skill of binding. As a result, the next moment the girl to her surprise was bound, unable to do anything or move. The frightened bodyguards immediately began to ask if she was all right, and said that they would help her, but she shouted at them not to move. Without as much anger as before, she looked at the main character and asked him who the hell he was and what rank he was. He scratched his head nonchalantly and replied that his name was Li Fun, and he was a D-ranked hunter. Boss Nia gritted her teeth in anger as she looked at the guy, wondering if he really was a D-ranked hunter, and if so, how could the system be so wrong in determining his strength level. The pause was interrupted by a noise coming from where the big guy was supposed to be lying. Turning their heads, they were surprised to find that he was alive and could even stand up. The protagonist smilingly turned to him and asked if he was going to fight anymore. But in the next moment, he heard Wang Lei shouting at him to dodge. However, Li Fan stared at the big man, who suddenly became even bigger, froze in place trying to understand what had happened. In the next moment, the former gang leader's huge fist hit the stomach of the protagonist who was frozen in place with all his might, and he immediately cried out in pain. The former leader of the bald gang no longer looked like a man, but like a rabid zombie ghoul, shouting furiously and swinging his fists. It looked like it would be a challenge to defeat him, even for our hero.